Welcome to Dungeon Master Deep Dive. I'm Mason Edwards, the Dungeon Master of Arcane Adventures. It's been a while since our last DM Deep Dive episode, mainly because I've been doing exactly what we're going to talk about in today's episode. In this episode, we're going to explore the idea of world building. Now, to clarify, I could make 100 of these videos and never get to tell you everything. So we're just going to focus on the high points, the overall stuff today. If you're new to world building, or you're just getting started in the process of world building, this video is here for you. We have a lot to cover, even as a broad overview, including different styles, professional tips, my own experience, coarse and fine details, and tying in your story to your world. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Well, what is world building? At a topical level, world building is the process by which a world, typically a planet-like entity, is created for use in a game. World building is very common. We see it in video games and in tabletop games alike. When designing a world, the creator, which for a tabletop setting is going to be the game master or the dungeon master, has to answer some big questions about how they want their world to work. And there's some methods to help you figure that out, and we'll talk about that later. But before that, my first major tip is to start with an idea. This, of course, is very broad, but let me give you an example. Several years ago, when I was scrolling through the web, before Arcane Adventures, before Ilethia even existed, I came across this picture. I saw a village on a cliffside, a massive waterfall dividing it in half. And I knew that I wanted that picture, that super cool picture, to be a town, a village in a fantasy game. And so I started working around that. And soon enough, that image in my head, a replicable version of it, became the town of Clifterra on the vast world of Ilethia. So starting with an idea as a place, or a character, or mechanic, or culture, or really anything that is a jumpstart, is your gateway into world building. You can, of course, do the process without having the initial inspiration, but it tends to be a lot more difficult if you don't know what you're trying to accomplish. While there are arguably several ways to go about world building, I find it best to classify all of them based on one of two strategies. First, and far more common, is called top-down. In this style, the creator, the game master, starts with the most basic ideas first, such as the world, and then they build downwards, almost like the top of a pyramid and then going down to the base. An example would be to create the name of the world, then decide how many continents, then how many countries per continent, then place each capital of those countries, then flesh out towns extensively, and so on and so forth. Basically, you get more and more complex. You start simple, getting more complex as you move further into the world, almost like you're zooming in on a map. The other style is called bottom up, like starting at the base of the pyramid and working towards the top, in which you start with a super complex idea, knowing all the details for one location, one concept, and then you build the world around that. Now, let's move through the world of Ilethia as if we were following both of these styles. For top-down, I would start with Ilethia as the name of the world. Then I'm going to decide to put 4 continents on this world and give them names: Hotan, Kilauea, Phonorbia, Iazlan. I would then ask, how far apart should these continents be? What terrain do they have? What countries go with the topography? Once I put these pieces together, I might focus more on one continent, let's say the continent of Iazlan, and then I decide that I want to put 5 countries on this continent, and that 3 of them are involved in a great war. I might design the capital cities in specific detail, decide which races and which intelligent species live there, identify each style of government. I might list all the major festivals that go on in these capitals, and so on and so forth. As you can see, the smaller the scale you go, the more specific questions you have to answer, which is good because making those decisions for every location makes your world feel more real. It gives it flow and diversity that is unmatched. For bottom up, taking the same example, we started as a specific lever, like Clifterra. What is the neighborhood in this town like? Who runs this town? When was it founded? What is it known for? Then we move on to what lies around the town. What landscapes? Are there any strange things going on in the countryside? How far away are the next towns over? Then we move up to the country scale, then a continent, and ultimately a world map, getting more and more broad as we go. Both of these methods are useful, and neither one of them is more beneficial than the other. It just depends on what you're feeling and how you want to go about the process of world building. Now, this is a perfect lead in to my next point, a concept known as the veil. Now, I want to stress this a lot. It is literally impossible to build a whole world and know absolutely everything there is to know about it and build the full world in its full entirety. You just can't do that because that would take an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of knowledge space to store, which you unfortunately do not possess, and none of us do. You're just trying to get your world ready for your campaign next month or that one job that you want to do. We've all hit this point, the invisible barrier, which poses the ultimate question to you as the world builder. Should I do this? Should I prepare for this? Or should I not? The best advice that I can give to you, and that any experienced DM will tell you, is to use a building trick called the veil. There are two aspects of the veil to consider. One is the veil of knowing, and the second is the veil of unknowing. Imagine two circles on a page. Oh, would you look at that? Two circles on a page. In the middle is the information that is necessary for you to plan your story, such as character hometowns, important places you'll visit during your story, and relevant details about your world for the game. Things that you absolutely need to know. This is the information that you have to prepare. Now, there's a line, that first inner circle, the veil of knowing. This is that gray area, if you will, between what you know you don't need to prep and the stuff that you do. The stuff here is information that you should probably know something about, but it doesn't necessarily directly affect your gameplay. We call those relevant details. It's the stuff that, as the GM, you know exist. Things that you have general plans for. And stuff that your players generally know exist, but they don't necessarily have a lot to know about it. They don't need to know a lot about it at the time of you starting the game. And lastly, we have the veil of unknowing, beyond that outer circle. This is all of the things that you know probably exist as the game master, but you don't need to prepare because it has little to no impact on your game. All of the irrelevant details. So if I was doing a seafaring campaign and my plan to spend all of the time at sea in my game, then there's no need for me to prep any inner mainland cities, maybe just the port cities. So that all the irrelevant stuff, what's going on in the forest in the middle of a continent, I don't need to know that. Now, this sounds a little bit confusing using these veils, and the model can be a little bit to read, so let's go through an example from Alethea. When I was first planning the Quest of Desolation campaign, I set up basically all of the Kingdom of Bupilazu. I knew each region, every biome, every town name, most of the probable sizes and populations of each town. I knew the relation that Bupilazu had to other countries. I planned all the major roads. I knew who the principal leader was, the king of each, and who the region leaders were, all the counselors. I knew the world information like the calendar, the seasons, the weather, the year, and the date, how many moons were in the sky, and the rough travel times and distances to big locations across the globe. But that's about all I knew. And that's all my players needed to know when we started the game. So what about the currency used across the ocean? Or the culture of the people on a different continent? Well, at the beginning, I didn't really know. And I didn't need to know. And my players certainly didn't need to know. Why? Because it had no real impact on the game when I was starting. So when my party planned to go to space for our Chapter 13 in the Quest of Desolation, I planned out astral ports. When they went into the nation of Esmeen for a stealth mission in Chapter 14, I finally made a country map for Esmeen for the first time in over a year and a half since I started the campaign. When we did the Tales from Alethea Caldenhide, a Broken World series, this was the first time I had ever planned anything specific about Hotan or Phenorbia besides their most basic concepts. This example highlights all three areas. The known information is all the information my players needed to know. Their hometowns, their backstories, NPCs they knew, and the city that they were starting in, Cliff Terra. The Vale of Knowing was the capital of Upilisu, Pronathia City. At the time, I knew it was there, and my players also knew it was there, but they didn't need to know anything else about it. And I didn't either until we moved there later in the game. All I knew is that it was some huge city built in the middle of a country around a massive lake, and that's where the king lived. And that's all my players needed to know in order to play the game. I didn't need to prep anything beyond that. And the Vale of Unknowing includes all three other continents at large, of which we all knew existed, but I knew nothing else about them. Things beyond my capability of preparing when we started the game. I didn't need to know. The beauty of a tabletop role-playing game is this progressive world-building style. It's literally a continual process. As your players explore the world, you create information, locations, lore, NPCs, side quests, fun facts, and the like as necessary. In fact, Matthew Mercer, my absolutely favorite DM, and a huge inspiration in my DM career, did this exact thing. In Critical Role, Campaign 1, Vexalia and Vaxeldan lived in Byrodin, on the continent of Taldore. But because that town never got visited in Campaign 1 or Campaign 2, aside from being referenced, Matt didn't create any other lore other than knowing it was there. In fact, Abria Iyengar actually created the lore for Byroad when it appeared in EXU, which is an Exandria Unlimited. And that is the first time that the knowledge for Byroad ever really came into the picture. They used this model of the Veils. Needless to say, the Veils are what help you categorize what you need to know and what you need to prepare and build from what you don't need to do. A big trick is to use them. Plan what you need and what is relevant, and let the rest simply play out in front of you as necessary. If your players ask you about something that you don't have planned, tell them that they need to research more about that in-game, or make some short, on-the-spot name and write it down. Then, before next session, if it needs the necessity to do so, then flesh it out to a greater degree for later use when it comes up later. Now, let's talk about a major topic that I feel like a lot of DMs in the beginning can struggle with. And it's a big one. How to anchor your story to your world. The age-old question, which came first, the world or the story? In short, it's often easier to set a story in an already existing world. But that is not to say that you can't build a world for a story. In D&D, I feel like, personally, it's a healthy balance of both. You tailor the world to your story based on the type of story you want to tell. If you're running a horror-themed campaign, like Curse of Strahd, you're going to want to build a world fit for horror with graphic elements. If you want a campaign that's artsy and cute, you might make all the locations super colorful and friendly. The story and the world go hand in hand. I had designed the most basic foundations of the world of Alethea prior to running a campaign in it. But I knew I wanted my starting location to be Cliff Terra, so I planned a lot about Cliff Terra before the story really ever began. And then once I knew who was playing, I came up with reasons, one way or another, for why each character would be in Cliff Terra at the same time. And to solidify that reasoning, you always want to prepare some kind of simple but impactful encounter that kickstarts your story that brings everyone together to form a party. In Cliff Terra, at the time that we started the Quest of Desolation, it just so happened to be the Festival of Founding for Upilisu, a nationwide celebration in remembrance of the country's independence from Esmeen. Cliff Terra was in full swing preparing for this festival, and each of the player characters were going to be in attendance for one reason or another. That night, during the feasting and dancing, while the music was playing, a large meteor, a star, if you could call it that, fell from the heavens and appeared to crash not far outside the town. A few people, the player characters, were each curious enough to go investigate. And the rest is history. These simple events drew each member together, and you really want to make sure you accomplish that in a meaningful and memorable way, because it sets the waypoint and anchor for your adventuring party. Beyond that, around session 3, I wanted to begin to introduce an antagonist. So I used an organization called the Undershadows, some criminal entity that existed, to give my players another reason to trust each other, to build character relationships, and focus on one common enemy. Of course, at the time, I had no idea that this organization, the Undershadows, would impact the campaign as much as it did later on down the road. But as my players continued to explore the world, it became increasingly apparent that this organization was exactly the recurring villain I needed to segue into a larger scope of the campaign. As my players learned more about the world, they also learned more about the reach and influence and corruption of the Undershadows, which propels both the world of Ilethia and the story, the Quest of Desolation, as necessary. Tying your story to the world and vice versa makes both the story and the world fun to explore and develop for both you and your players. Plus, it makes everything flow better and ultimately leads to a better game. In the words of Brennan Lee Mulligan, so much of world building is what is said in the moment and taken as fact. Role playing during the story of the game, during your sessions and time in the world you're building, can add a lot of world building and take the pressure off your shoulders as the creator of a world. Sometimes the players will say something that you hadn't thought about. You hadn't even given it much realization, but maybe this concept is a great idea, so you run with it. Not only is this how the principle of the gameplay works when the DM says something, it kind of goes, but it is also one of the most organic ways to add to your world. If a player says that a village across the sea is known for its mermaid sightings, well, maybe it has always been that way and you just didn't know it until now. Your players are looking for information and stumble across an ancient book detailing a place you hadn't thought of. You spit out a name, and now that place, somewhere in the vast infinite cosmos, exists, and there's a book about it. Take what is said in the moment and run with it. Obviously, use some moderation, but run with the game. And that makes the role-playing fun, and it's adding to your world all at the same time. Now, we've covered a lot, and we've only really barely scratched the surface of the proverbial world-building iceberg. In the next video on world building, we'll tackle the major questions to focus on when creating worlds. I hope this is all beneficial to you, and am happy to share my experience and wisdom with you. And if you're building a world right now, best of luck to you, and I hope that this helps out. That's all the time that we have for today on Dungeon Master Deep Dive. So we'll see you next time.